Welcome, and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is author of a wonderful book simply titled Peak Everything, which is waking up to the century of declines. Most people, when they think of peak, they've probably heard about peak oil. Well, about 10 years ago, they said, we're getting to the point that we're running out of oil, so it's either going to be more expensive or we're going to be out of it in general. What about coal, for instance? How about just talking about fossil fuels in general? But now all of a sudden there's a big movement that everybody is getting involved with, at least in the last 5 to 7 years, simply called the green movement. I kind of liken it to greenwashing, in which it's just another advertising campaign to get people steered in the direction of doing what we've been doing over the last 100 years. Joining us here on the program today is author of this wonderful book, Peak Everything, and I'd like to welcome to our program our guest, Richard Heinberg. Richard, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, Daniel.
Peak Everything. This is a fun, elusive book, and I say that because you start off with, he's going to share, what the realities are of us draining fossil fuels, but then it transitions into a wonderful piece on how we've created the tools that this particular energy has actually, created, and sort of how we are at the human condition of where we're at now, and answers the tough questions, or at least shares possibilities of what we can do about it should this happen. Talk about how you came to write this book.
Well, I had written 3 previous books on fossil fuel depletion, mostly peak oil. And it was becoming increasingly apparent to me and a lot of other people that I'm in touch with, analysts of all kinds, that it's not just a question of peak oil. We're actually running short of all sorts of natural resources. And while oil isn't going to, completely deplete anytime soon, what's happened is that we've extracted the best first. We've gone after the low-hanging fruit. And so as time goes on, we're forced to go into, for example, drilling in ultra-deep water in the Gulf of Mexico. BP would only be doing that, which is very expensive and obviously hazardous, if there were no easier places to explore for oil, and that's the situation we're in. But it's not just oil. It's also, as you said, coal and natural gas and metals, everything from antimony to zinc, minerals, topsoil. We're destroying topsoil at a rate of something like 25 billion tons a year through industrial agriculture, fresh water. We're running out of space in the atmosphere to put all the carbon dioxide we're generating through burning fossil fuels. So really what we're looking at is the result of a couple of centuries of rapid economic growth, with more people consuming more stuff and generating more waste in the process. And this can't go on forever. It's pretty obvious, and we've had analyses and forecasts from folks going at least back to the limits to growth study of the early 1970s, saying that it can't go on forever, and sometime in the 21st century, this whole industrial project is going to start winding down. And the basic point I'm trying to get across in the book is we've reached that point. We're here. We have hit the limits to growth. Mm-hmm. And so our job over the coming century is really going to be centered around adjusting our lives, adapting society as we know it, as we've built it, to live within nature's limits. That will happen one way or the other. The question is, will we plan for it? Will we do it successfully, or will society just be battered down by those limits and suffer the consequences? Mm-hmm.
And you also bring up, in light of talking about peak everything, that with this new energy as it was back in the early part of the century of 1900, is the fact that it made our tools more accelerated to where we used less human energy than we had to before. When we were doing arts and crafts, for instance, it was done by the hand. It was actual human labor. And you gave a real startling analysis or analogy, if you will, about in America, with everybody driving every car and truck, that it was actually burning how many human?
Well, it's as though each of us, each American has something like 300 energy slaves pushing us around all the time. And we take this
we didn't tolerate that in the South, did we?
Right. Well, that's slavery. Human slavery was really about energy parasitism. The folks who were owning slaves were living off of the biological energy of the people who were enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
But that was something that worked under the regime of muscle power. We domesticated animals, oxen and mules and horses and so on, so that we could use their muscle energy too. But once we discovered fossil fuels, we had a source of energy that was so much more concentrated, so much cheaper, so much more convenient to use that slave power actually economically didn't make sense anymore. And that was part of the backstory of the Civil War, in fact, that the industrialized North was effectively more energy efficient because it was beginning to use fossil fuels. Actually, coal didn't become the dominant energy source in the U.S. until the 1880s, but things were already starting to move in that direction.
Mm-hmm. That's what I mean for the listeners out there on this Peak Everything. Really, you go into the history of how things came to be how they are now, and what's interesting about that is, in knowing that history, you realize because of the use of fossil fuels, how a lot of our skills and our creativity has been put to the wayside to a point of almost being forgotten. Now, once these fossil fuels are at a point that we can no longer viably use them, whether it's going to be destructive, which it obviously is to the environment, we just plain ran out, or it's just too expensive to even bother with, then what is a person to do when they don't have those basic skills? And you talk about that in human energy and creativity, and it's quite interesting how we've turned into a culture to the degree that we have.
Right. Yeah, the book is in some ways a collection of essays. I mean, mm-hmm. I try to examine different aspects of the human condition at the end of the industrial period and look at what this means for, as you point out, our skill sets and how we live and what we do in our lives. But of course, the argument does turn to a certain extent on questions like, can alternative energy sources replace fossil fuels so that we can just keep on doing what we're doing now, only with solar panels instead of oil wells?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question, of course, is long and complex, and I don't go into it in great detail in the book itself. I have written a fairly lengthy study called Searching for a Miracle, which is available on the website of the organization I work with, Post Carbon Institute, postcarbon.org, and you can go on the website and get a free PDF download of this study. But basically, the upshot of the study is that, there are lots of alternative energy sources. We look at 18 of them, and we analyze them across 10 different criteria, including environmental impacts, the energy return on the energy that you invest in building the infrastructure for these various energy sources, whether they're renewable or not, and so on. And the conclusion that we came to in the study was that there really isn't any combination of alternative energy sources that's capable of picking up for fossil fuels in the time that we have over the mm-hmm. next few decades. So what that means is, as fossil fuels deplete and as we turn away from fossil fuels because of their climate impacts, we're just going to have less energy. Mm-hmm. And that has enormous societal implications. It has implications for what we do for a living, because if there's less energy to go around, that means that we're going to have to, as you point out, redevelop some of these basic skills that our ancestors had that enabled them to, grow food and make things and reuse and recycle things rather than, just getting in the car, going to the store and buying something new.
Mm-hmm. I think it's funny that we've gotten to a point in this day and age that we have to really read the ingredients of our food rather than just saying, "What? Isn't that a fish? Isn't that chicken?" I mean, it's gotten that stupidly ridiculous I don't know how many times we've talked about, for instance, diets here on this program.
Yeah.
And there's a billion people out there telling you, ways that you can eat to feel better, stronger, faster, whatever the case is. But when you have to read a label, when you actually have to count calories, for crying out loud,
yeah.
Is this sort of how fossil fuels have led us to sort of mindless thinking about what we're doing?
Well, sure. I mean,
not to point the finger at fossil fuels,
yeah.
but it certainly perpetuated these behaviors.
Well, the chain of causation is kind of complicated there,
mm-hmm.
but once you start looking at the industrial food system, it's pretty clear that we have shaped our food system to accommodate the necessities of fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. How we produce food with tractors and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, all of those things either made from fossil fuels or using fossil fuels. And then our globe-spanning food system where, you go to the grocery store and a piece of a food item you pick up may have traveled 1,500, 2,000, 5,000 miles to get there. And then the kinds of ingredients that we use, things like high fructose corn syrup, well, that's a product of modern industrial agriculture. It's because, we can produce corn so efficiently using modern machinery and so on. It's so cheap that, we started looking for ways to use more of it in the food system and turning it into sugar syrup and then putting that in all kinds of food items. Well, it was just cost effective and it was kind of addictive, and so we end up, as you say, with all these processed foods with long labels of ingredients, and it's not doing us any good. And we can't keep doing it anyway because we don't have the cheap fossil fuels to do it with.
Yeah, it makes you wonder when somebody actually says to themselves, "You mean I can't just go to the butcher block and order a salmon? I actually have to learn how to catch one if I can find any."
Yeah, right.
Now, what I really, one of the interesting things that you say in your book, because we're on the subject of food, is that you say that you can really understand a culture or a society by how food is produced. Could you please explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, this is one of the primary insights of the discipline of anthropology, cultural mm-hmm. anthropology. Everybody's heard of a hunting and gathering culture or an agrarian culture or whatever. Anthropologists use these terms to define different kinds of human societies because they learned over a long time through trial and error that if you know how people get their food, then you can pretty well predict lots of things about how these people are living, what they believe, the kinds of cultural practices they engage in, and so on. For example, if people get their food from hunting and gathering, and unfortunately there aren't any left in the world today, but that's mm-hmm. how we all lived for thousands and thousands of years. But hunter-gatherers have to live in small bands. They unless they're living in a very, very abundant environment, they have to roam over pretty large territories in fairly small groups to harvest the wild fish and game and wild vegetables and so on, nuts and berries that they can come across. It takes lots of skill to do that, and so their religions usually also center around the worship of nature spirits and facets of the natural environment and so on. But then after people start to rely more on agriculture, on field crops, then society becomes more pyramidized. They can produce surpluses of food, and so that means guarding those surpluses and managing them become full-time occupations for certain people within the society. For the first time, you get full-time division of labor, full-time soldiers, full-time priests, full-time, you name it, first appear with agricultural societies. Couldn't have happened with hunting and gathering societies because everybody was involved in basic production in those kinds of societies. So once we get agriculture, we get kings, we get armies, we get full-time division of labor, and that has huge societal impacts that we're still living with today.
Mm-hmm. I remember I believe it was the book, The Sovereign Individual, which he actually went through a really unique history about what you're talking about there, and how once something began to grow large, then as you said, we get kings and we get armies and the like, and then eventually governments, and you kind of think, okay, governments, it's kind of interesting that they came in through politics to be able to create what perhaps, small police forces or bodyguards couldn't do, and that is for protection. And it's quite interesting that as you look at the industrial age, which was the creation of the use of fossil fuels because of how it drove the tools, as you say in your book, is that governments could then grow in power because they can actually find, okay, this is, for instance, General Electric. Okay, well, for us to protect you from anybody else infringing on what you guys do, you're going to pay us to do that. And so eventually you start thinking about the Constitution, for instance, in and of its own right, that the government is there to protect we the people. Well, that depends on who we are.
Yeah. Well, nation states as we have them today are pretty much an artifact of the industrial period. Mm-hmm. And the shift from the agrarian community to the industrial state was just as important a societal shift as the shift from hunting and gathering to primitive horticulture. It was a profound change in all aspects of life. I mean, from the sheer number of human beings on the planet, fewer than 1 billion at the beginning of the industrial period to 7 billion today, to how those human beings live demographically, the huge shift toward urbanization to where half of humanity lives in cities today. Mm-hmm. Never happened before, never could have happened before. So we have huge agglomerations of people, and that necessitates government on a much larger scale than it had ever existed before. Mm-hmm. So with fossil fuels have come political, economic, and social changes that we more or less take for granted today, and I think very few of us take the time or trouble to trace these enormous societal shifts back to where they really issued from, which is the energy sources that we rely on.
Mm-hmm. Certainly it was much different than the original fire that we were cooking our meat and protecting ourselves with.
Right. Well, in that case, we were relying primarily on wood. Mm-hmm. And so we had a wood and muscle power economy for thousands of years. Now, fire itself, of course, was an enormous shift in the history of our species. Fire probably dating back several tens of thousands of years, certainly, perhaps even a couple of 100,000 years, there's some evidence. And then agriculture dating back several thousand years, perhaps 10 or 12,000 years to the beginnings of horticulture, and then field crops about 7,000 years ago. But then, again, the shift to industrialism just over the last 200 years has been as significant a change in our species history as either of those previous ones.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about industrialization and how we use fossil fuels, and we'll just keep it basic, and that is for the production of food, okay? Mm-hmm. And so, because it made food easier and quicker to produce, not meaning that it was better for you, that meant that we started taking on a shape that we should be able to do that with pretty much all things, that nature was basically now literally at our fingertips for us to command. But now we're realizing the ripple effects of that as we've been seeing great extinctions beginning to happen with plants and animals around the world. And in fact, I remember it was about 10 years ago, Wade Davis, anthropologist Wade Davis, his book was Light at the Edge of the World, and he was talking about how we're losing languages at the rate of 1,200 languages a year, and says, can you imagine you being the last person on the planet who has no one to talk to? Because, he says, just imagine what's being lost there. And what I liked about your book and Peak Everything is you go into talking about the arts and the crafts and the real stewardship of what it means to really be sustainable.
Right. Well, this, as you say, this is a huge cultural shift because we've had an enormous, varied cultural mosaic over the past thousands of years. Something like 15,000 individual identifiable human cultures that anthropologists have made note of. And today, those languages, those cultures are being absorbed and exterminated by the mass society that high energy, the high energy of fossil fuel brings us. We have globalization. We have the opportunity to get in an airplane and be on another continent thousands of miles away just a few hours later. Well, this is an enormous convenience, but it also has a tremendous homogenizing effect. And, you could say, well, this is inevitable. This is just the direction of history. We just have to get used to it. But again, we're talking about something that's inherently unsustainable.
Right.
This fossil fuel society is not something that will just go on in perpetuity. We're headed ultimately and inevitably in a very different direction, back toward a much lower energy society. And we're not going to be very well adapted for that because we will have, in the meantime, lost our local adaptations, the skills, the cultural knowledge and understanding that helped us live in the unique and particular environments to which each culture was adapted. And so that loss, that enormous cultural loss, is something that I think we need to fight against. We need to preserve culture, locally adapted culture, wherever we possibly can, because it simply makes sense.
And you bring that up when you talk about fighting against it. People, for instance, they don't like what happened or what's happening down in the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, BP's doing this, and Exxon, they crashed one up there in Valdez, Alaska, and it's on and on and on, and there's all these finger-pointing, but we'll get back to the basics here about that now.
Sure.
You talked about the hippie movement in your book, and I found this to be really interesting, and there are 2 points of view to make with that. There was the true movement that really did it without using fossil fuels, and then there was the one that did. Okay. Now, why I say that is there was an interesting documentary which was called Berkeley in the 1960s, and talking about the events that were going on around the college campus there in Berkeley, California, and that was where they had actually created a community garden. Okay. And what was really frustrating was that here these people came together that show that you really don't need to go to a job to earn the money to get food and clothing, that it's all available right here if we just learn how to cooperate and to share and to be creative. Right. Well, that frustrated a lot of the people, the citizens of San Francisco, who had to jump into their cars each day and go to a job they probably didn't like. So eventually they paved this garden and turned it into a parking lot, such as the song goes. But then on the other hand, there were these same hippies, not these same ones, but the other ones that were saying, we're against government, we're against, large industrialization, but, then you gave the example of Woodstock. So it kind of makes you wonder, where's our thinking in this paradox?
Yeah. Well, a lot of us, and I have to include myself, I was growing up during that period, a lot of us sort of took the...
You could afford to be liberal because it was cheap, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. And we took the fossil fuels more or less for granted, and electrification, and so, the whole hippie culture was very largely based on electrified rock and roll music, and yet the electricity that was going to power the Marshall stacks that. Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton were, playing their guitars through, that electricity was coming from coal-fired power plants. So here, we were singing about peace and love and freedom, and yet the very power, literal power that was enabling us to do that was coming from this huge industrial system that was the very thing that many of us were so upset about. So I think it was a kind of naive idealism. There were many very good aspects to it, and particularly during the 1970s, I have to say, there was a lot of very, very good work done with regard to organic farming, organic gardening, and energy efficiency. I mean, if you go into a used bookstore and look for books published in the 1970s on these subjects, you will find some stellar information that is still extremely useful today. Mm-hmm. And a lot of folks who are writing on these subjects now are basically just recycling the ideas that were around then.
Mm-hmm. Now, so as our listeners are tuning in here, we're talking about the book Peak Everything. Our guest today, Richard Heinberg. Now, Richard, it's interesting because, as you say, look, this is inevitable. We just can continue doing what we're doing, and pretty soon we're going to find ourselves hitting a wall, and we won't like the way that feels or looks. Not that it's any good right now. But at the same time, you share ideals and resources of how a person can say, okay, the first thing I need to do is take a look at how am I participating in, call it this mass illusion, if you will, that I need to get into my car to go to a job, to pay for all these things that I think I need. Or how do I get back to a point that becomes to a point that I feel happy because not only am I serving myself on a basic level without destroying the environment or, causing extinctions of species of plants and animals, inconveniencing my neighbors, but actually serving as well. And you talk about that, and there are two particular designs that we've actually covered on the show when it comes to that. One of them is permaculture, and the other was bio-intense agriculture, was it?
Yes, bio-intensive.
Okay, right. Let's talk about what those two things are, because this is an attitude that I think that if people started approaching that in their backyard, both or either of these things, I think they would begin to change what they're doing in this world, and they wouldn't be hitting that wall, at least with a bad grin anyway.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about bio-intensive first, because it's a narrower category. It was pioneered by a brilliant agricultural scientist named John Jevons, who lives here in Northern California, about 100 miles north of where I live. And Jevons, for the last several decades, has been basically pursuing the question, without fossil fuels, how can we support ourselves, and also without undermining the biological viability of soil and ecosystems. So he tries to answer questions like, what's the minimum land area that you can use to grow all of the food and fiber that a given individual will need, and how can you do that without destroying the topsoil? So he and his organization Ecology Action have many publications that are really well worth looking at. One of the practices of biointensive that's pretty well known now is called double digging, where you basically are just loosening the topsoil to a greater depth than most gardeners do, to make more water and minerals available, and by doing that, you can usually plant your plants closer together. You increase the yields, and then if you rotate your plantings in a sensible way, you have the basis of a pretty sustainable system. Jevons also talks about recycling of all organic wastes, and that means not only crop wastes from the garden itself, but also ultimately we have to think about recycling human wastes, because otherwise we're just robbing the soil of nutrients as time goes on. So biointensive is, I think, a really important contribution to the whole discussion of how we can feed ourselves and survive as time goes on. The other one that you mentioned, permaculture, is a little bit more general. It's a little more ambitious, actually. It was started by a couple of Australian ecologists back in the 1970s, and their whole idea was to make a permanent or a sustainable culture. And, of course, that has to start with food, for reasons that we talked about earlier. And they use a lot of the same principles as biointensive, but they broaden that to a whole design process, a sort of design for living, design for habitation, for land use. And if you take a class in permaculture design, for example, you'll learn about why it's useful to have zones on your property, zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. And in zone 1, you have your garden veggies, all the things that you want to look at and tend to on a daily basis. And then a little bit further out, you might have some of your land that's devoted to tree crops and perennials. And a little bit further out, you might have things that you don't have to look at on a very regular basis at all. Maybe some of your land devoted just to habitat for bees and birds and pollinators of various kinds. And if our whole society was organized that way, we would end up with a pretty sensible way of living. Of course, we don't. What we do is we grow thousands of acres of corn or soybeans or wheat or whatever, and organize our societies around the dictates of the fossil fuel transport system. Mm-hmm. But that's another story.
Now, you gave a great example of how this can work when, for instance, let's call it a community, runs into the point where the fossil fuel just isn't made available in the stand. The one I'm specifically talking about that you talk about in your book is how Cuba adapted to that situation once the Soviet Union fell.
Right.
Talk about that. That was quite interesting. You said, they were able to make the transition. It wasn't easy, but they made it, and they made it successful, and it's still going on. How's that looking now?
Yeah, there's a wonderful documentary film made by some friends of mine called The Power of Community. And listeners, I would highly advise listeners to look that up and get a copy online. But essentially, what that film shows is back in the 90s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its cheap energy. Cuba had been importing lots of oil very cheaply from the Soviet Union. It was a kind of hidden subsidy for the Cuban government. And as a result of that, Cuba was very, very energy intensive. The Cuban farmers were using more fossil fuels per acre than American farmers were. They had these big Soviet tractors and giant fields of sugarcane and other export crops. And so when they lost that cheap fuel subsidy, it was like an existential crisis for the island nation of Cuba. And they very nearly succumbed as a result of that. There was not starvation, but malnutrition on a fairly substantial level. The average Cuban lost, I think, something like 20 pounds of body weight. But how they dealt with this is very interesting. There had been some organic agronomists in Cuban universities who'd been arguing for many years that Cuba's industrial agriculture really needed to be reformed, and they needed to go back to using less fossil fuels and producing crops in a more sustainable way. And basically, they'd been marginalized. Nobody was listening to them. But when this crisis arose, Fidel Castro called these people in and said, "Hey, look, what you guys have been advocating for actually makes some kind of sense in this context. So why don't you take charge of the food system and see if you can figure this out?" And they did. They cut up the big state-owned farms and turned them into much smaller co-ops and private farms. They promoted the breeding of oxen and other draft animals that could be used in place of the big Soviet tractors. They promoted urban gardening and urban agriculture, so that today a very large percent of the vegetables and fruit and nuts that are grown to feed the people of Havana are grown right in the city. They promoted farmers markets, and they also raised the salaries of farmers to make the occupation of farming a lot more attractive to Cubans. And they made it a requirement that everyone who goes to college has to learn something about agriculture, as well as whatever their major subject is, whether it's being a doctor or a lawyer or engineer or whatever. They also have to learn how to grow food. And so part of their time in university is also spent actually out on the fields growing crops. So with all of these efforts, they managed to avert what would otherwise have been really a horrific humanitarian crisis. Mm-hmm. And it could serve as a model for the general adaptation of society in other countries to the gradual the gradual end of the fossil fuel age.
Mm-hmm. It's really quite interesting to view the overall scope of when fossil fuels came into play, when they became an important, if not the cornerstone of existence, and using the United States as an example of that, since that seemed to be where the most tremendous development of fossil fuels occurred, as far as usage and technology are concerned, is that we were at a point where we were community, going and, do you have a cup of honey that I can have? Can you do this? And there was a real barter. I mean, money was involved, but there was a real sort of genuine bartership that happened between people. And even today there are communities such as the Amish community that still live by those standards, but they're doing very well in other ways as well. But that you take a look at how fossil fuels came into the human existence, and it seemed that we started getting away from that to where we didn't even know the names of our neighbors, even if we lived together for 10 years. And you got to ask the question, did technology make our existence better? And in some cases it could be answered yes, but overall, even on a philosophical or even a heartfelt level, it seems no, that it actually kind of, I guess, shattered us, kind of, kind of a thing. But do you obviously see hope on the horizon for this, that as we become more aware of our actions, that we're all responsible for where we're at, that we can move this in a good direction with plenty of time, or how do you see it?
Right. Well, yes, and I think it really does hinge very largely on what we do here in the U.S. You pointed out that how fossil fuels have changed life in this particular country, and it's worth remembering, I think, that this is where the oil industry started. Mm-hmm. Back in the 19th century, the very first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania in 1859. Many Americans forget that this was the center of the world oil industry for decades. In most years, more than half of the entire world's oil production was coming from wells in Texas and Oklahoma and Southern California and Ohio and Pennsylvania. So it was no accident that this is where the auto industry really got its start, and the airline industry, aviation, got its start here with the Wright brothers. It's no accident that this is where the whole suburban way of organizing, economic life got its first foothold and really changed almost every aspect of how we live. So if all of this started in the U.S., then that means that this is where we're going to have to pioneer the alternatives also, because the U.S. is already a post-peak society. I mean, U.S. oil production hit its maximum all the way back in 1970 and has been declining ever since. And we've been relying more and more on imported oil every year and paying a price not only geopolitically, but also in terms of our economy, our balance of trade deficit, and just our national psyche, knowing that we are so dependent on this imported stuff that we used to produce for ourselves, and now we have to police the rest of the world so as to keep the supply lines open.
Mm-hmm. I know. Are you familiar with the works of John Perkins?
Yes, I am, the economic hitman.
Right, exactly. And he talks about how we go over to other countries and, especially you get the situation that's happening in Ecuador, millions of gallons of oil, whole ecosystem more or less destroyed. We're still fighting over that. But what was interesting in his book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, is I found that there was actually a parallel to what you're saying in your book, which was Peak Everything. And that is to take a look at how, for instance, fossil fuels put us in a situation that we could command nature, okay?
Right.
Instead of allowing, for instance, that if you're about to, say, build a dam, bring together an engineer and an artist. And there was an example that he talked about in his book where there was a waterfall in Ecuador where they actually brought an engineer and some artists together, and they took a look at this waterfall and said, we can harness energy, but we're going to create a dam that looks like it's naturally part of the scape, much as like the water wheels back in the 1800s. rather than these massive walls that just go right across the river, end up flooding valleys and destroying everything, and you realize that it produces as much, if not more, energy than some monstrosity like that. It seems that it's time, as E.F. Schumacher would say, that we scale down to becoming small again.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Well, that is the direction of the future, whether we plan for
whether
it
we want it or not, right?
And there is a social movement now that's all organized around doing exactly that, planning for a smaller and more localized future, and that's the so-called transition towns. Mm-hmm. They got their start over in Britain just a few years ago. This is still a very, very young movement. But the idea was, we have to transition away from fossil fuels for both climate reasons and also because these fuels are finite and they're depleting away. And so, life is going to look different. We're not going to be as mobile. We're going to have to produce more of our own food locally and do more gardening and get to know our neighbors, have more localized economies. So what's that going to look like? How can we organize that ourselves on a grassroots basis, rather than waiting for some, government, president, governor, prime minister, whatever, to get the ball rolling, which of course they're pretty reluctant to do. Mm-hmm. So it started with a brilliant young guy named Rob Hopkins, who, interestingly, was a permaculture teacher. He had a permaculture course that he taught for adults at a college in Southern Ireland. He moved back to his where he had lived before in Southern England and started the first transition town in Totnes in Devon. Back in 2006, I think, something like that. And this has taken off like wildfire. There are now hundreds of transition towns all over Britain and Ireland, Scotland, some in continental Europe and Spain and France. In Australia and New Zealand, there are about 70 or 80 transition towns that are getting going in the U.S. And this is really exciting stuff because, it gets people together, not in a spirit of protest. It's not like we're out to stop BP and Exxon. I mean, efforts like that are arguably worthwhile, and I certainly wouldn't want to stop anyone who's inclined to do that. But this is a very positive kind of effort that, it's more like a party than a protest march. People are getting together to share their skills and to learn how to do these things that are actually, very enjoyable and fun to do, and get the whole family involved in the process.
Now, it's obvious because of how we got to the point we have gotten to, how our collective thinking is. And as this comes out of your book, you say this is no small problem. Advertisers, manufacturers, politicians, economists, and the general public will have to grow some wisdom and do so quickly to override the customary impulses toward individualism and the preservation of familiar comforts. What's interesting about that is that we had individualism. We had autonomy before. We had creativity before, and then because of the development of fossil fuels, it got a lot of us to basically sit on our butts thinking that we were having all those things, but it was a lot easier when, in fact, it was taking those very things away. Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Individualism versus communalism is a very complicated discussion because, in some ways, in earlier times there were more real individuals. More real characters, people who were figuring things out for themselves, and today we have more of a mass culture that's created by mass media. I mean, people all plugged into the same information sources, and they may be polarized. You may have Fox News on one side and MSNBC on the other, but basically, people's opinions and ideas of themselves are shaped to a very large extent by advertising and these mass images. But on the other hand, this mass culture is a very individualizing culture. It tends to cut us off from one another in terms of our actual interdependence. You get this even in families. I mean, parents and children may live hundreds of miles away from each other, grandparents and aunts and uncles, so that a family reunion might involve 20,000 miles of air flights to get everybody in the same city. And that's just one example of the kind of individualism that's rampant in our society today. Whereas, as you mentioned earlier, people don't know their neighbors, and getting together on for any civic project is just a huge effort, because people just aren't used to doing that. We're used to being in our own little cocoons where we're plugged into the internet and cable TV. Have we lost community? Well, yes, you could say we have. Have we lost individualism? It depends on how you define individualism. It's changed us in ways that I think actually if you did some careful polling, you'd find that most people are really very deeply uneasy about how these aspects of modern life are impacting us.
I would actually agree with that. In fact, I was just recently talking with a social studies teacher, a high school social studies teacher, and I had brought up, the John Perkins book, and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that." And I said, here's a question. Since you're a social studies teacher, and I believe what teachers' roles are is to present the facts as best as they know them, but allow students to be able to draw conclusions through their experience on their own. And she says, I really agree with that. And I said, well, here's a great example. Since you're in a period that seems heavily influenced by the new invention known as the cell phone. You talk about disconnection to reconnect with people. That's got to be the worst thing I've seen since cancer. But, the fact is the question that I would say to impose on her, I can't remember what the metal was that's used in the cell phones and also used to build the cheap computers, but it comes from Africa. Now, we sit there and we talk about this world hunger problem, but yet this is a metal that, is making billions of dollars in the cell phone and the computer industry. Why is where it's coming from causing such poverty? And get these students each time they want to text just thinking about what they're using and what impact that has on a country you've never been to before. And it's getting them to change their habits just a little bit at a time by making them aware. I think that could be a very important step, just like books such as yours.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we have to pull these things apart. We have to start thinking for ourselves, because the system itself doesn't encourage that, that means looking at history. History is maybe not the most popular of subjects for a lot of people, but finding out how and why things came to be the way they are, to me, is just one of the most interesting and exciting pursuits. And it's tremendously practical, because if we don't understand how things have come to be the way they are, if we don't understand the context, then it's very likely that as problems arise, we just won't have any clue as to how really to respond to them. We'll just be plugging leaks with our in a stopgap way, rather than having any vision of how things were, how they are, and how they can be.
Now, I think what's fascinating too, as you mentioned, and I just kind of have wondered. I like this president just because of his accent, but he seemed to be the last bastion, at least, who was advocating and trying to get the message clear. Look, we need to scale back. We need to live within our means. And that was the President Jimmy Carter.
Right.
Okay, but unfortunately, because of the situation that was happening in Iran, he became a very unpopular president. As well, a lot of our presidents aren't perfect. But then the Reagan administration stepped in, and of course, the Bushes, and it seemed that we accelerated to the point which was so opposite of his message. It's like we accelerated a wall that he foresee in the Earth Day movement coming. It was coming slow, but it was coming. But then all of a sudden we jumped in a dragster, and now we're racing toward it.
Right.
How do we put the brakes on?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I mean, clearly actions like the transition initiatives will help, but to a significant degree, I think, and I almost hate to say this, but I think we missed our chance. You mentioned Jimmy Carter. You go back and listen to some of his speeches, like that of April 18th, 1977. You can find it on the internet. You can even find it on YouTube and actually watch him delivering that speech. And it's extraordinary. He's describing two paths. One path is reducing our energy consumption, developing alternative energy sources, and he tells us it's going to be a tough road. We're going to have to make some sacrifices. We're going to have to tighten our belts, but it will lead us to a future that's sustainable and ultimately very happy. Mm-hmm. And the other road, he says, is becoming more and more dependent on energy imports and more increasingly dependent on fossil fuels. And that road is going to lead toward international conflict. It's going to lead toward an ultimate economic crisis. And, he was absolutely right. That's where we are today. We have reached the peak everything economic crisis of the 21st century. And it's not something that's going to be over tomorrow. This is going to be going on for the rest of our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. And it was all foretold back in the 1970s.
I remember being a child, at least in grade school, and I'd caught a documentary, and I'll tell you, those documentaries in the 1970s were scary. You even had Dr. Seuss, with the Lorax, saying, hey, this is what's going on. Okay, that's a cartoon, even though it was well done. People, okay, that's that. I'm just going to go on, doing what I'm doing. But now we're at a real impasse where we better start making some very solid decisions as individuals and collectively to, well, at least hopefully soften the blow that we've created for ourselves.
Right. Well, this economic crisis is the new edition of Peak Everything that's just coming out. The paperback edition has a long introduction written especially for this new edition that is takes into account the economic crash of 2008 and what's happened since then. I really think that we're in a new era now. This is not going to be solved with bailouts and stimulus packages. We are seeing the contraction of the global economy and certainly the U.S. economy, and this is really going to test us. We are going to have to, as communities, pull together and find ways to support one another, to support a more localized economy, to find ways not just of feeding one another, but of making sure that everyone in the community has shelter and all other basic necessities. This is really going to be like the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is going to be a time that really tests who we are as a people and as a nation.
Mm-hmm. But yet you still feel very encouraged.
Well, in some ways, waking up from the illusion or waking up from the dream, even if it's an uncomfortable experience, is good, because if the dream goes on too long, there's a danger that we won't wake up at all. And that mm-hmm. The worst situation would be if somehow we could continue to increase our rate of consumption of resources and destruction of the biosphere until we got to the point where the result was human extinction, and that's not outside the realm of possibility. Mm-hmm. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is we have reached a crisis stage where growth has ceased. Mm-hmm. Economic growth, as we've known it over the past few decades, has basically come to an end, and that's forcing us to reassess a lot of our previous assumptions. So we could do this still in more sensible or less sensible ways, and in my writings I try to the best of my ability to suggest how we could respond to this crisis in more constructive ways. Hopefully this message, not just from me, but from a lot of other folks who are treading this same path, will get out, and we will be able to come together as communities and take some sensible actions.
Well, I certainly feel encouraged that even as mass as the media is, that there are a lot of daggers that are really coming up and out and saying, look, this is a lot of nonsense, and people are actually starting to read between the lines and even listen between the lines. But inevitably, what they also have to come to understand, as I've said consistently on this program, it always starts with you.
Right.
That's the bottom line. Don't be pointing your fingers at anybody. It starts with you.
Exactly.
And so,
it's not a matter of finding scapegoats.
Mm-hmm.
When times get tough, the worst thing that can happen is that we all just, go at each other's throats,
mm-hmm.
whether it's liberal and conservative, Christian and versus Muslim, and
mm-hmm.
That if we go down that road, then there's not a very happy future for this country or for the human race. What we really have to do is start seeing where we have things in common as human beings, as communities, and come back to our strengths as people. And those are inner strengths, and they're very earthy strengths, and they have to do with the kinds of basic skills and understandings and cultural achievements and motives that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm. The book is Peak Everything. Our guest today, Richard Heinberg. Richard, if you could, for our listeners, give out a website, and I know that your book also has great resource information for continued reading and study and as well as action.
Yeah, well, if folks are interested in following my work, the best website is just richardheinberg.com. But also, the organization I work with very closely is called Post Carbon Institute, and you can find information there at postcarbon.org.
Richard Heinberg, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Yeah, well, it's been a real pleasure, Daniel. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. We also encourage you, the listeners, to get out there and visit us on our website, beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50 with a 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. We also have a great blog there where we post and archive interviews such as Richard's here today for you to listen to and share with others. We thank you for tuning in. I'm Daniel Davis. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.